Listen, I'm not gonna say that Gege Akutami is currently in the midst of making the best manga he's ever made, but I'm also not gonna say that. Now I know a lot of you are thinking, oh Nick, you're being hyperbolic. You're a YouTuber whose livelihood at least partially depends on the concept of Gege Akutami making good manga. But I'm being dead serious with you guys. Well, obviously Modulo is not better than JJK already. After reading chapter 9 of Modulo, it seems as though Gege has remembered not only how to write backstories, but also how to write characters. Now, for being real with ourselves, Gege has always kind of been the potential man of the JJK universe, because with JJK, he had infinite potential to make one of the greatest mangas of all time and kind of blundered the ending. And that could be exactly what's happening right here, right now. Modulo is being set up as a deeply interesting and conflicting manga with no real bad guys. And by the end of this relatively short manga, Modulo is going to turn itself into a paint-by-numbers shonen story. But chapter 9 of this story, it stirred something in me, which is saying something when you consider the fact that chapter 8 was so boring, I literally did not cover it on this page. See, not only did this chapter give us the backstory of the Samrians, or specifically the Lumer people, and an explanation as to why they were pushed off their own planets, but also it gave us some more backstory to what we believed was the Sukuna-level threat that was living amongst them. And all throughout this chapter, there is fantastic world building, plot twists, and political commentary that to me make this one of the best chapters that Gege has ever penned. But who knows, maybe I am just trying to drum up hype because I enjoy this manga and I want you to enjoy it as well. How about we go through it together and then we can decide on whether or not I'm being hyperbolic or not. Because today, we're talking chapter 9 of Modulo Explained. Before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional Nick video every single week, you guys can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. We're on to the second episode of Kiba versus Naruto. So, like I already sort of mentioned in this video, I obviously did not cover chapter 8. It was a chapter focused primarily on setting up chapter 9. Basically, we got an introduction to the backstory of the Samrians, or as we now know them, the Lumer people. See, because while Samrian still denotes the race of alien that they are, in Samaria there are different tribes of people, and the tribe of people that were driven off Samaria were the Lumerians. Now this happens because the Lumer people have been exiled by all the other more powerful tribes because they worship a kind of deer deity that attacks everyone else who isn't the Lumerians or just the Lumer people. I don't know if you can call them the Lumerians. However, in order to ensure that they bring prosperous trade to their region, the Lumer people have decided, or at least one amongst the Lumer people have decided, to build a canal across their land, a lot like the Panama Canal, so their land can become a prosperous shipping channel. And they were trying to build this channel in collaboration with another tribe of Samrians known as the Deskunta. However, after the channel, or canal, was completed, a Karivan actually consumed the daughter of the chief of the Deskunta. And as everyone else believes that because the Lumer pray to the Karivan, and because the Karivan don't attack the Lumer people, that the Lumer are able to control the Karivan and possibly send them to places to attack other people, the Deskunta use this as an act of war. And that is where chapter 9 begins. Well, at least kind of. Chapter 9 actually begins giving us a breakdown on how the Samrian third eye works. Something that we've been curious about for a while now, on account of the fact that people like Maru and Cross have shown Jujutsu-like abilities from their third eye before. Thus, chapter 9 opens telling us about how a Samrian's third eye gives them access to something known as Roroka, and how Roroka is basically the Samrian equivalent to cursed energy. Therefore, any and all Jujutsu-like techniques that a Samrian wants to use, they have to channel through their third eye. Now, we're also told that members of the Lumer tribe are the only people that shed tears from their third eye, which apparently only happens when a Karivan dies. All of the rest of the Samrians in existence only shed tears from their third eye when they are either born or when they die, because apparently shedding tears from their third eye causes an immense amount of strain on their brain, and actually can be fatal. That information isn't necessarily useful until the end of the chapter, so just tuck it away for the moment. We open up chapter 9 with an elder of the Lumer tribe telling the entire tribe that the daughter of the chieftain of the Deskunta was devoured by a Carrion. Carrion? I think I've been saying it with a V this whole time. As she's reporting all this to the de facto chieftain of the Lumer people, Dura. As she continues on by saying that the Carrions in the Deskunta tribal area were eradicated decades ago, and therefore a tragedy of this scale really couldn't have happened unless a member of the Lumer tribe sent a Carrion to the Deskunta tribal area, or at least that's what it looks like. Now, obviously there is a possibility possibility that there is some treacherous member amongst the Lumer tribe who sent Ikarion all the way to Diskunta tribal area so it could specifically assassinate an important political figure. But there's also the possibility here that the Diskunta tribe specifically sacrificed one of the chieftain's daughters so they would have an excuse to take all of the Lumer's land. We can't say for certain. We kind of get an answer during this chapter, but not really. Anyways, the important takeaway from all of this is that the Diskunta people are demanding 90% of the Lumer tribe's land, including their freshly made canal. Refuses this request, the Diskunta will retaliate with war. Now this obviously strikes a ton of fear into basically the entire Lumer tribe. However, fortunately, or maybe unfortunately, the Diskunta don't settle their arguments through war, but rather a duel. And apparently the envoy has already put in the request for a duel against the Lumer tribesmen. See, apparently Samrian is pretty similar to Earth, where those who hold great power usually have great authority, or at least that's the way things used to be before, like money was invented. And while that lay of the land may be true with the Lumer, it is apparently especially true with the Diskunta, where the strong are given the most power out of any of the tribes on Samrian. And thus, apparently, the way this conflict is going to be resolved is through one-on-one combat, with each side choosing one warrior to represent them, and the victor of the fight will prove that their side was correct in their claim, after which they'll be able to devastate their opponent's lands and people until their goal has been achieved. However, even though the Diskunta are seemingly a much more powerful tribe than the Lumer, a lot of the young men amongst the Lumer tribe are actually not all that worried about the idea of a duel between the two tribes, because apparently before the Lumer village was destroyed and they were displaced from where they used to live, Diskunta held a tournament, and the victor of that tournament was Dura, the de facto chieftain of the Lumer people. Now this comes to the surprise of Maru and Cross, who weren't even born when this tournament happened, and more Lumer people begin to chip in and say, yeah, even the head warriors of the Diskunta were involved in this tournament, and the matchups were specifically made to give as much advantage to the Diskunta people as possible, and yet Dura still won. Honestly, that's not all that surprising. If we take basically the only power feat we have from Dura, which comes from chapter 8, last chapter, we saw that Dura, with one strike, was able to basically pulverize a roughly 20-foot tall sphere of rock. I did a couple of pixel calculations here. I'm assuming Dura's somewhere in the region of 6'5". I mean, he's the head warrior of a tribal nation, and he seems almost as tall as Dabra, who is notably tall. And the boulder that he explodes with just one punch appears to be roughly 4 times his height, so somewhere in the region of a diameter of 20 feet. Assuming that stone is some kind of medium toughness rock, like marble, with just one punch blowing that rock up into manageable bite-sized pieces that 2 children at the time, like Maru Cross, would be able to pick up and move, take an exertion of force somewhere in the region of 10 gigajoules. And for those of you who don't know, in 1 metric ton of TNT, that's 1,000 pounds. There's about 4.2 gigajoules of energy. So we're talking about a force being exerted on this rock that's roughly about 2.5 kilojoules of energy. Now, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki nuclear bombs, the smallest ever dropped, packed a terrifying 15 kilotons of explosive force, meaning that the energy that Dura was able to inflict on this rock to basically pulverize it in one punch was roughly equal to 1/3 of the energy delivered with either the Hiroshima or Nagasaki bombs. But what does that mean? Does that mean he's a city-level threat? No, it doesn't. See, the blast diameter of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs was somewhere in the region of 2 miles. Total and complete destruction, like you're a shadow on the ground, was about 0.8 miles. But residential buildings were destroyed all the way up until about 2 miles out. So if we highball the explosive force of the Hiroshima bomb and say that its explosive diameter was somewhere in the region of 2 miles wide, and then take that force and times it by 0.33, we would get an explosive diameter of 0.66 miles, which is big, really big. If you took a track that runs around a football field, those ones that are a mile long, and turned it into a perfect circle instead of an oval, its diameter would only be about 0.32 miles. It's not until you double the length of that track and make it a perfect circle that you get basically the area that Dura would be able to devastate with just one punch. The diameter of a circle whose circumference is 2 is roughly 0.64, if I'm doing my math correctly. So in terms of AP, what is that? Well, very comfortably multi-city block. So yeah, you could could understand why the Lumer tribe would have a fair amount of faith in Dura's ability to win, and thus the hopes and dreams of every single Lumer tribesman is now hanging on the shoulders of Dura, as they cry out in the night about how he's the strongest warrior in all of Samrian. However, Dura doesn't seem nearly as prideful as everyone else, as he tells all of them to stop it and lets them know that there were some people who didn't even enter the tournament. And it's at this moment that the narrator, who is Cross, says at this moment we probably should have considered, we being Maru and Cross, why Dura never told us about this victory in the tournament. But Cross chips into the conversation and says, a duel? Is there no way to refuse it? To which the elder, who told them the news about the Diskunta chieftain's daughter being consumed, says no. The Diskunta respond even more poorly to the refusal of a duel than the loss of a duel. So it would be better to take on this duel and lose than to say no. And thus it becomes evident to the entire Lumer tribe that refusing and losing are basically the same thing. And thus Dura, will grabbing the back of his neck and scratching it, says, all right, I guess I'll fight. And in the next panel, we see the Lumer people, the Diskunta people, all sitting and cheering inside of a coliseum. However, as the Lumer warriors sat and watched the representative from Diskunta walk into the center of the coliseum, they all became certain of one thing, and one thing alone, that it would be absolutely impossible for Dura to win. And that's because Dura was to face off against Dabra. Now, for those of you who don't remember who Dabra is, we've seen him a couple of times over the course of Modulo. He's the guy who looks like Ichigo's hollow form. The tall guy who walked in when Jabara and Cross were talking with Usami and Mino. It made the two of them realize that the Samrians are a Sukuna level threat. And it's starting to seem like Dabra himself might have been the Sukuna level threat. Because simply by basking in his presence, Cross leans over the guard railing of the Coliseum and yells out to Dura, it's impossible, Dura. You have to run. You'll be killed. Even if you run, no one will blame you. Please, we're all grateful for you. Get out! But Dura simply turns around and looks at Cross and says his name. He then turns to Dabra and says, long time no see, old friend. How's your sister? Is she a hostage? It's this moment that Dabra begins to sigh with a dour look on his face as he asks Dura what he's supposed to do, as they, and by they, I'm assuming he means the Diskunta royalty, have told him to keep going until Dura is dead. But Dura reassures his apparent old friend as he says it's okay. The outcome is not important. What is important is that you do a favor for me. He then ushers him over and tells him something that we don't hear. But we see that Dabra's face lights up with a light smile as he tells Dura, understood. He then takes a step back and says, let me talk for a minute, because there are many people here that are not just Lumers or Diskunti. And on the next page, we see Dura begin to address the entire crowd as he turns to them and says, listen up, everybody. I understand there's a wall between the Lumer people and the rest of you, most likely because of the religion that we practice that has us worshiping those that would attack you, the Karyan. But the exile of Lumer 10 years ago and the beginning of this conflict was not because of a religious war. That is simply what you were told. In actuality, the reason that the Lumer were exiled to a different region was because the Diskunta wanted access to their mole mines. And it's at this point that it's revealed to us by Cross, who is the narrator, that mole is a semi-rare ore that's able to convert Raroka into all different kinds of power. That is to say that it is a precious commodity to the Samrian people. And under the guise of a religious conflict, the Diskunta, the more powerful between the Diskunta and the Lumer, cast the Lumer out so they could gain access to their valuable commodity. And this kind of thing has happened in our world hundreds of times. Whether it was the Crusades to Jerusalem in the 1300s, the forced spreading of Christianity in places like Europe or Asia, or even the concept of America versus those radical Muslims over there in the Middle East, which is actually just mostly a cover for America to gain access to their oil reserves. Time and time again, conflicts that have really nothing to do with religion have the religion stamp stamped on them for the exact reason that Dura makes in this chapter. As Dura continues on by saying that even if war broke out between our two tribes right now, its true cause would not be religion, but rather someone up high's economic scheme or ambition. It'll be framed as a religious war so other people hesitate to help out, as they'll think, I don't know, it's a war between two religions. Surely there's something I don't know. And therefore they'll back away from mediation or aid, afraid if they help one religion, they'll be damned by the other. And as he continues making these points, we hear murmurs amongst the crowd as they realize that what's going on might be exactly what he's currently describing. But for fear of being executed by the Diskunta, they keep their voices low. Dura continues on by saying, but religion in its truest form is meant to be a set of principles that you live by each day, not some kind of grandiose cultural identity. I shall not cheat, I shall not steal, I shall not kill. I will help those who need help, and if I live by these set of rules, hopefully one day I'll be allowed into some kind of afterlife. However, when religion becomes a cultural identity and it's wrapped up in every single thing you do, you've lost the plot of what it was originally trying to accomplish. See, because what the Lumer people wanted was not respect for their religion itself, but respect for the lives that had grown up in it. And thus Dura makes one final plea to everyone inside of the Colosseum to respect the Lumer people as their regular people, just like them. And therefore he pleads with everyone to simply recognize them as neighbors. However, with his speech now over, the Diskunta chieftain tells Dabra to begin. And it's at this point that we see Maru perched on top of the guardrail in front of his seat, ready to jump into the Colosseum. And it's important to note here that Maru was the only person who did not look intimidated when Dabra walked into the Colosseum, maybe something to put away for later. However, before Maru can jump into the middle of the Colosseum to possibly fight against Dabra, Cross grabs him by the back of the head and slams him down and restrains him. But this doesn't stop Maru from screaming at the top of his lungs at Dabra about how Dabra held back and how he didn't give Dura the entirety of his power and therefore disgraced him as a warrior. And we see on the ground lays a beaten, bloodied, and very dead Dura. And to this point that Dabra walks up to the two of them and says, "I'm sorry. I didn't want to hurt his face." It's at this point that Cross, through his narration, tells us that later on he heard that Dura and Dabra were actually quite close friends, and that before the Lumer were isolated, the two of them trained together as warriors and pushed each other to their brinks, because apparently Dabra didn't like to stand out, and Dura was the only person who saw how immensely powerful he was. Now, this is important. Remember earlier when we established that Dura was a multi-city block level threat? Well, yeah, that's like a kinda where Sukuna caps out. Sukuna's AP with his domain expansion and his Fuga arrow that turns everything in his domain expansion into a thermobaric explosion is basically able to eviscerate everything within a 200-meter radius or diameter, I can't remember which, of his location. And while the ability to turn everything within that radius into a thermobaric explosion does boost his AP a little bit higher, his AP caps out somewhere around large town level. And thus, if we assume that Dura was somewhere in the region of multi-city block level in terms of AP, and Dabra was able to fight him without getting a scratch, holding back and making sure he didn't destroy Dura's face, that means Dabra is substantially stronger than Dura. And thus the idea that Dabra would be able to achieve something in the region of a large town level AP is not crazy. And therefore, when Usami and Mino met Dabra and were like, oh my god, the Samrians are a Sukuna level threat, they might have just been talking about him. This feat right here does put Dabra in conversation for could he possibly defeat a full-powered Sukuna? And that's kind of nuts. Anyways, we then on the next page see Dura's funeral, where he's laid in a casket filled with flowers and his third eye is crying. Remember, the third eye of the Samrian people only cry when they are born or when they die, or in the case of the Lumer tribesmen, when a Karyan dies. And after we see Dura laid in his casket, we're served to a flashback of Cross, Maru, and Dura working on the canal, where Cross asks Daru what the word neighbor means to him, because he's always saying it. To which Dura responds to by saying it means close friends to you who understand why the things you find important are important. And thus on the next page we see this line that Dura pleaded out to all of those who were in attendance at the Colosseum, please recognize us as your neighbors. But we see Cross staring down at his casket thinking, that's impossible, Dura. More than anything else, you were the most important thing to us. And after Dura is laid to rest, we see the Lumer tribesmen sitting around a fire trying to figure out what they're going to do. As by tomorrow, this area will belong to the Diskunta. They'll have no land, no canal. They won't be able to farm. Disease will spread through their tribe. They'll all most likely die. And thus some of them begin to make plans to raise arms against the Diskunta, because it's better to die in combat than to slowly wither away. But Jabarama, the politician, I guess you could say, amongst the Lumer people, lets them know that it is not the role of the warriors to fight and die, but rather to save the women and children. And thus they begin to hope that maybe those who are in attendance at the Colosseum will heed Dura's plea. But before they can make any real plans, Dabra emerges from the edge of the darkness as he lets all of them know that Dura left something behind for them, after which Dabra takes all of them to what I believe is possibly the end of the canal, as it's revealed that Dura has supposedly been hiding what appears to be a literal mountain of mule. And to this point that Cross remembers when they first began to work on the canal with Dura, when he told Cross and Maru to not touch that group of rocks over there, because apparently that group of rocks was the mule. Now everyone begins to pontificate about how he was able to find this much mule, why he hid it, and they come to the conclusion that he most likely hid it because he understood the Diskunta would want it, and that the Diskunta weren't able to find it because the area around where the canal was dug was all carrion nests. However, even though they were standing in front of this mountain of mule, they all realized that sooner or later the Diskuntans would find it, and that all of Dura's efforts were in vain. We then get another flashback of Maru asking Daru what incentivized him to begin building the canal by himself. At which point Dura tells him that towns and villages, they're the embodiment of the will of people of the past, and that even after he's long gone, this canal that he built will remain, and thus he's just a singular step in a long cycle of Samrians trying to make the world a better place. And this point seemingly lands home with Maru, as we flash back to the present where Maru is telling all of them that all of this mule that they found is not a waste, and rather it's a path forward laid for them, the Lumer, by Dura. Then see Maru place one hand on the mule and reach his other hand out to Cross, who takes it, and the two of them begin to glow in aura that we can assume is Raroka, and all of the mule begins to float into the sky in aura bubbles, as Jabarama thinks to himself, no way, this isn't mule, it's something purer. And thus Maru turns to everyone and says, well, shall we go looking for a place we all belong? But the Lemurians yell back at him and say no such place could ever possibly exist. Maru assures them and says there's a planet somewhere out there with people like us that will allow us to live amongst them. But this concept of leaving Samria and going to a different planet kind of baffles everyone. The tide changes in Maru's favor when Dabra steps forward and says, I'm leaving too. I promised Dura I would protect all of you. And thus Maru, with a point towards the sky, says, then let's go to the far reaches of the sky to find our neighbors. And behind him we see the mothership that the Samrians came to Earth on, in the process of being created by this mountain of mule that Dura left behind. Now, this chapter is awesome for like a ton of reasons. Not only does it give us the full backstory of the Samrians or the Lumer people, but it even conveys the advantage of showing us that even the warmongering Samrians, like Cross and Jabarama and Dabra, may truly only want war because they've tried everything else. See, I actually believe there's a fair to decent chance that Earth is not the Samrians' first stop. See, well, obviously, yes, we do see the sentiment from Cross at Dura's funeral that it's going to be impossible to become neighbors with anybody else. Cross doesn't seem nearly as jaded in this backstory as he is on Earth. And as the editor's note at the end of this chapter is, and so their journey began, I do believe over the course of the next couple of chapters, we're going to see that even though this trip did start out optimistically, it unfortunately probably didn't pan out as well as Maru had hoped. And thus I believe that Earth may be the final stopping point for the Samrians, and if they're not able to figure out peace on this Earth, unfortunately, they're gonna have to take a more Diskuntian kind of approach, taking Earth for their own and casting out humanity so that finally they won't be the people being shooed away. But listen, these last two chapters, while they possibly could have been less interesting to some of you, are a masterclass in character development. Because while I probably shouldn't care about the Lumer tribe or the Samrians, I now do. I see their point of view. I can see why they would be upset. I can see why some of them would want war. I can see why some of them would want peace. And making both sides of the argument, when one side of the argument has the grandchildren from some of the main characters of the original story that this story is a spin-off of, seem like they're understandable and not morally corrupt, is really difficult to do. And thus, yeah, I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that I currently believe Gege Akutami is turning in some of his best writing. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. What did you think about this chapter? Did you think it was some of Gege's best work? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go try to do chess for the first time in a month, and I'm real excited about it.